Everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I am super excited to share with all of you my review of the NATASHA DENONA Glam palette. So this Midi Glam palette is one of her overall best-selling palettes, and for myself, I'm really late to this party. I feel like so many people have been raving about this palette for so many years. A lot of my favorite beauty content creators have cited this as their all-time favorite NATASHA DENONA palette. And so I'm kind of late to the game on this because for me personally, for the longest time, I wasn't that into cool-toned neutrals, especially more gray undertone shades. I just found them a little bit less flattering on my warm yellow peach undertone skin. But recently, NATASHA DENONA was having a sale on her website, and I finally decided to bite the bullet because I do have a lot of her palettes. I have 17 of them, so I figured it was about time that I picked this up, if for no other reason, to at least review it for you guys and compare it to the other palettes. But since then, it's been a few weeks that I've had this palette, and this has quickly risen to be one of my favorite NATASHA DENONA palettes. I actually just filmed a NATASHA DENONA rankings video, so if you guys are interested in that, it might already be up, and if not, it's coming out. But this has really quickly risen in those rankings, and so I thought it would be fun to also do a full dedicated video to this. I'll show you guys several looks using this palette, swatches of course, some comparisons, and my overall review now that I've used this palette for a while. So if you're interested in learning more about this Midi Glam palette, then just stick around. So let's start out with packaging. So here's the back of the box that the palette comes in case you guys want to pause and look at any of the details. The palette itself has this beautifully reflective gray packaging, and you can pop out the shades and rearrange them. It's made in Italy and has a 24-month shelf life. Unlike other NATASHA DENONA palettes, the shade names here are referring to where you can apply the shades on your eyes, which if you guys remember when this first came out, that was kind of controversial because of course it depends a bit on your skin tone in terms of where these shades would be more ideally placed on your lids. So since the NATASHA DENONA has put on her website a few options, so if you have like light, medium, or deep skin tones, she has different arrangements she would recommend, so you can basically pop them out and rearrange them based off that. For me, I have a light medium skin tone, and I found that generally speaking in all of the looks I've done so far, I've basically, for the most part, put the shadows where she has recommended, and it's worked out pretty well on my skin tone. But of course, that will vary a lot depending on your skin tone. So for the swatches, I find for NATASHA DENONA palettes, it's more helpful to go by color rather than to go just left, right, top to bottom, because you can already see on her product page what it looks like going in order. And with these palettes, there's a lot of shades that are quite similar to each other, so I find putting similar shades next to each other is just more useful for discerning how many looks you can get of the palette and which shades are very close to each other. So to that end, I'm going to first swatch all of the mattes, and I'm going to kind of put them in order of color, and then do that with the shimmers as well, just so we have some nice comparisons. So let's first just start out with the shade Transition. It's a very light shade, so it might be a little bit tricky to see it on my wrist, but it's a really beautiful shade to set up any look. It's very, very light. Next, we have Crease. This is a little bit deeper, a little bit more taupey in tone. You can start to see a little bit of brown in that as well. Really beautiful as a transition shade as well, or as a mid-tone deepening shade. Then we have Blend over here, and this one is a little bit more warm toned, but it is a similar level of depth to Crease. So if you want something that is less cool toned, it's good to go into this shade, whereas if you want something a little bit more gray, these two work really well together. And then we have Smoke over here. So this one is yet another layer of depth. This one actually built up does look pretty deep, and so for a lot of looks, like today's look for example, this is the deepest shade that I used. And then finally, we do have this black matte over here, Lash Line. So this way you can definitely get plenty of smoke with this palette because you can always deepen up any look by going into that. And it's interesting to note that all of these mattes are in her creamy matte formula. That's her more traditional powder matte, which I know is very confusing, but the other matte formula she has is the cream to powder. That's the one that's a little bit more controversial because it can sometimes ball up and sometimes performs well, and some people love it and some people don't. But one thing that's nice about this palette is if you don't like that formula, this one only has kind of the traditional matte formula. So here we have a close-up of the mattes, and also I will note that compared to most other Natasha Denona palettes, this one actually has a lot fewer matte shades, so that's something to note. It's a very good palette for someone who loves shimmers, but you are a little bit limited in terms of the mattes. So with these 5 mattes out of the way, let's get into the 10 shimmers. So quite a lot here. I'm going to start with Inner Corner over here because this is the lightest shade. And you can see that it is very bright. It's actually less frosty on the skin than you might expect based on how it looks in pan, which for me I prefer because I don't really necessarily like a super frosty shade. There's a little hint of gold in this as well, so that makes it a bit more versatile. Then we have Inner Corner. This is the highest shine shade in the palette and my personal favorite. I find that this one has the most glitteriness to it, which is really lovely. Next, we have Center Eyelid. This one is a tiny bit more gold in tone in comparison to the Inner Corner shade. So I will say one downside about this naming scheme is there are multiple shades that have the same name to them, but hopefully you can see here that this one's a little bit more silvery, this one's pinkier, and this one is a bit more bronzy gold. Next, we have Brow Bone. So this one is quite similar to the previous one actually, maybe just a hair less shimmery. I mean, this is why I like doing these swatches this way, because I think you can tell there's a lot of similarity to these shades. So maybe that's the one downside of this palette. You can get very similar looks, I would say, with fewer shades. So next, let's go into the center eyelid shades, starting with this one over here. So this is the most golden. Whoo, wow, look how metallic that is. Really high shine. You can see this has a lot more pigmentation than the previous ones, which almost are a little bit more translucent in comparison. Next, I'm going into the pinky center eyelid shade. This one also packs much more of a punch. And then finally, we have this really silvery gunmetal shade. Whew, look at that, wow. So you can see quite a stark difference between these 3 that are all very distinct versus these lighter versions that do tend to kind of look similar on the skin. So now we have 3 more shades for outer eyelid. Let me start with this one over here. This one has more of a satin finish in comparison to the previous shades. So of the shimmer shades, it has the least reflectivity. And then these last 2 honestly look very similar. Let's start with this one. This one also looks a little bit more satiny. Yeah, there we go. And then the last one over here looks a little bit higher impact, a little creamier. Yeah, maybe just a bit more reflectivity there. So here we have the close-up of all of the swatches. And I think you can see now the slight differences between these. These 2 look super similar in pan, but this one actually swatches a little bit more silvery. It's a bit more reflective, whereas this one looks a bit deeper. This one definitely brings a bit more warmth to the party. On the whole though, it's definitely a very consistent color story. You can see a lot of tones that are quite similar throughout. So let's go ahead and get started with the first look. So as always, all the other products will be listed in the description box below in case you guys are interested. So I'm going to start this look out with Blend on my Goss number 16 brush. Normally I start out with one of the lighter shades, but I want a slightly less cool toned look given that I feel like the dress that I have on today does have a little bit more of a pinky romantic vibe. And so for this look, I'm going to focus in more on the pinky tones in this palette and see if we get something that's still kind of cool tone neutral, but a little bit less gray in comparison to most of the looks I've done with this palette. And as you can see, this is blending in super easily. I only have my Natasha Denona concealer on today as a primer. but these mattes are really buttery and just super easy to blend out and build up. Next, with my Goss 17, I'm going into Smoke, and I'm going to use this to start adding a bit more depth to this look. I'm not going to make this super deep because this is a daytime look, so this is going to be the darkest shade that I'm going to use. Although, as you guys can tell, it does add a decent amount of depth. I kind of wish this palette had another shade kind of this depth level, maybe a little bit lighter, that's just a little less gray in tone, because I feel like every time I use this palette, I do end up going into Smoke, and so that makes all of the looks a lot more similar than with some of my other Natasha Denona palettes, where I feel like I have more options for a mid-tone to deepening shade. In this palette, you have Lash Line, of course, as a deeper shade, but that really doesn't help in terms of giving that much versatility. That said, Smoke is really lovely, and I think it works well with all the other shades in this palette. And now with the finger, I'm going into Inner Corner. I really love this shade. This is probably my overall favorite shimmer in this palette, because as you can see, it's pretty high impact. And cleaning off my finger, I'm going into Center Eyelid now, since this will bring in that cute pinky tone. I actually haven't used this shade yet. This is one of the few shades I haven't really dipped into. In my previous looks, I was going for something a little bit more neutral and not really pinky, but I think it's perfect for matching my dress today. So now I'm going back in with that blend shade, and I'm going to use this to kind of zhuzh out the edges and just really blend everything together. This is supposed to be kind of a overall soft romantic look, and so don't want any harsh lines at all. Now for the lower lash line, I'm going in with my Sonia G Builder, again into Blend, putting this all over the lower lash line, then taking a little bit of Smoke for those outer corners, and then cleaning that off, going into Center Eyelid and sweeping that along the inner 2/3 of the lower lash line. And finally, with my Goss number 19 brush, I'm going to use this to put a bit of brow bone on the brow bone area. And just to mix it up, I'm actually going to take this Center Eyelid shade and put this on the inner corner today, just to have a little bit of peachy shine there. So here we have the completed eyeshadow look. So I went off camera to do eyeliner, and I'm not very pleased with the way it turned out. I think I definitely made this quite uneven today. So to maybe just try to help disguise this a little bit, I'm going to go back into Smoke over here and put this over that on the lower lash line. And then similarly here, I'm going to just take a little bit of Smoke and stamp that over where I have the liner, just to kind of conceal it a little bit, make it blend in with the shadow a bit more. So hopefully the precision of the line is less noticeable. Now just to zhuzh that out, I'm going back in with that Goss number 16. But there we go. Here we have the first eyeshadow look. And I'm really digging this first look. I think it does a pretty good job of sort of summarizing this palette in one look, because it really hits upon all of the major types of shades that you have in this palette. It's overall really soft and flattering, but you do have that pinkiness and a little bit of that gold as well. And so for the other looks, I'll probably go a little bit more into some of these silver shades or into some of these peachy shades. So here we are on a new day. So originally I was going to do another eye look right after the previous one, but I ended up really enjoying that one, so I decided to just wait for a different day to do some more looks for you guys. So for today's look, I wanted to do something that is really focusing on the kind of cool gray tones in this palette. So I'm going to start out with Transition, and let me actually bring you guys closer so you can really see what's going on. So today I do have my ABH eye primer on, so you can also see how this palette fares over primer. So one thing that is nice about this Transition shade is, even though it looks super light and pan, at least on my skin tone, I find that it still does stand out, and especially if you build it up, it actually can provide some pigmentation. Now, if you have a really deep skin tone, I feel like this is probably going to look pretty ashy on you, so it might be better as kind of a brightening shade. But at least for me, if I do a few layers like this, I can definitely see a little bit of that kind of taupey gray. It doesn't just come across as a really light beige shade. Next, with that same brush, I'm going to go into crease. And actually for this look, I'm going to use a bunch of different mattes just so you guys can sort of see how they compare to each other. So crease, even though it also looks pretty light and pan, definitely adds a bit more depth. I think if you have a deeper skin tone, this would be a lovely transition shade. And even on my skin tone, I find that if I don't want to use so many different types of shades, I can just start with this shade and it blends out really easily, so it works well as a transition shade too. So today, because things are kind of smoky, I'm going to also just sweep this all over the crease area. Now I'm going to start to deepen things with smoke, which you guys saw in the last look actually provides a decent amount of pigmentation. But today I'm also going to go into lash lines, so we're going to get even more depth than smoke. So I'm basically going to just sweep this all over the outer thirds of my eyes. And I'm using my Goss number 19. The previous brush was my Goss number 16. Alright, so there's smoke. So now I'm just going to take a little bit of lash line, and kind of as the name implies, I'm going to first just concentrate this along my lash line. You can see this definitely brings a lot of depth to the party, so you can honestly use this to line your eyes as well if you just want to have kind of a soft powdery liner look instead of going in with liquid liner. I'm just diffusing that for today's look. So for the shimmers today, I'm going to use these three over here because they're all kind of in the same very cool toned family. So I'm going to put this inner corner shade in my inner corner, or at least inner third area. I'm actually going to use a different shade for my inner corner. So you can see that nice, cool, but slightly golden taupey silver shade. And then I'm going in with this center eyelid shade, and I will put this in my center eyelid. And don't worry, I will blend these all together after this. And now I'm going to go into this outer eyelid shade. Just put this in the outer eyelid area. And now going back in with a little bit of lash line, I'm just going to use this Goss number 19 brush just to blend out this outer portion. And then with my builder brush, I'm going to kind of go over what I did with the shimmers, but kind of focus this time on just blending everything together. And with my mini booster, I'm going into this inner corner shade now for my actual inner corners. And I'm also going to use a little bit of this for the brow bone. Whew, that is quite shiny actually. Let me put whatever's left on this side and then try to blend this out a bit. So yeah, this one is actually quite bright for the brow bone. Now for the lower lash line, I'm going to actually start out with crease because I'm going to use fewer shades down here and just zhuzh this all over that lower lash line area. And then I'm going straight into lash line for the outer corner and just adding a little bit of that on both sides to deepen things up. And then cleaning that off, I'm going into center eyelid, putting that in the center, and then a tiny bit of that inner corner shade in the inner thirds. Basically just mimicking what I did on top, but just with fewer shades. And here we have the completed eyeshadow look. What do you guys think about this compared to the previous one? This one is definitely much more of a monochromatic look. I think it sort of captures this sort of grayscale effect that you can get with this palette, whereas the previous one I tried to mix in a little bit more of the pinks and golds. Personally, I thought the previous one was a little bit more interesting, but this one is still really fun. Definitely very minimalist and very chic. So now let's get into the third and final look. So I've already used all the mattes, but I'm going to start this look with transition and then go into blend to make it just a little bit different from the first look in terms of the matte setup. Overall, for this look, I'm not going to focus as much on the gray undertone shades because the last look was so monochromatic. And I want to make sure also that I use all the shades that I haven't showcased for you guys so far. So next up, because we do have a lot of shimmers left, I'm actually going to go in to outer eyelid. I'm going to use this on a reference number 15 and put this in the outer corner. So I'm kind of using this the way I would typically use a deepening matte shade. And as you can see, because this is a satin shimmer formula, it actually works pretty well for this use case. Next, I'm going into this outer eyelid shade, and I'm going to put this in the outer eyelid. As you can see, that just adds really pretty glimmery effect. This is definitely more shimmery than that brown shade, so it has a higher impact in terms of shine. And then for the center eyelid, I'm going to go into this shade over here. This is the most golden shade in the palette. I'm going to concentrate this in the middle of the eyes. It's a bit more foiled than most of the other shades. Very creamy texture. You can see there's still a lot on my finger. And then cleaning that off, I'm going to take a little bit of this other center eyelid shade and put this in the inner corner. So you guys can see maybe a little bit of the difference between those two. The second one is just a little bit less yellow and also less reflective in finish. Now with my reference number 21, I'm going to kind of repeat those steps and focus on sort of refining the edges of the shimmers just so they blend seamlessly together and with the mattes. So this one is definitely a lot more shimmery than the previous looks, but I think this is nice if you want a sort of lighter effect on the lids. So now for the lower lash line, first I'm going in with my reference number 2 brush into blend, and I'm going to just sweep this all along my lower lash line. And now mimicking way down the top, I'm going into that brown outer eyelid shade, putting that in the outer thirds. And then I'm using this center eyelid shade and putting that on the inner third. And then just a little bit of this center eyelid as well for the center to bring that gold tone. And then to finish things off, I'm going to go into brow bone and put a bit of that on the brow bone. And then I'm going into this inner corner shade and putting that on the inner corners. So here is the completed eyeshadow look. And here we have the final look with eyeliner. I actually really like this look. I think using the brown satin in lieu of one of the mid-tone mattes actually gave this a really nice kind of daytime friendly vibe where it's a little bit less smoky than some of the previous looks, but it's still really interesting and multi-dimensional. I'd be curious to hear though what you guys think about these 3 looks and which one you like the best. I think for me, I like the first one the best, followed by this one, followed by the gray tone look. So with all these looks out of the way, let's talk about this palette and my overall thoughts and review about it. So first off, I have to say I've been enjoying this palette so much more than I thought I would. As I mentioned, it's taken me several years to come around to buying this, even though I buy so many Natasha Denona palettes, I follow so much content about her makeup, and I've heard so many good reviews about this palette. For me, honestly, for a while, whenever I saw pictures of people using this palette, I wasn't really a huge fan of the looks. I guess I just felt like this sort of gray undertone look was not actually that flattering on the skin. And to be frank, when I'm looking back at the pictures of my looks that I've done with this palette, in photos, it also doesn't necessarily look as pretty as some of the other color stories that I've been trying recently. But in person, there's something just really beautifully chic about these sorts of cool tone neutrals. And also I think for me, what makes this palette really stand out and what makes me wear this all the time ever since I've gotten it is that it's just so easy to use. So for a lot of Natasha Denona's palettes, her shades are a little bit more mixed in terms of quality. Like there's some that are a little bit harder to use or maybe going hard pan. And also a lot of her palettes don't really give you a complete look. In particular, for a lot of her palettes, there's not necessarily a super deep shade or a really nice champagne inner corner shade. It's not like Pat McGrath palettes where she really puts all of the shades you need for a look together. With Natasha Denona, she's often kind of going by color story, and so if you look at, for example, the bronze palette, there's really not really like a brow bone shade, for example, in that palette. But what's really great about this palette is every single shade is just super easy to use. There's nothing super exciting about any of the formulations in this palette, but they're just so easy to use, so reliable, so beautiful on the lids. And then you just have all the shades that you would need on an everyday basis to complete a full glam look like this, while still having enough shades to kind of experiment with and get some versatility as well. So on the whole, I would say that if you are a cool toned neutral lover, buying this palette is really a no-brainer. I'm sure you will really enjoy this. Of course, if you're someone who mostly like warm tones or really colorful looks or really high shine sparkly shades, you're not going to get that from this palette, but at the same time you might surprise yourself. At least I surprise myself because I usually think of myself as more of a colorful, kind of sparkly eyeshadow look person, but I've really had a lot of fun with this palette. So that's it for today's video. If you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!